Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today.
It does sound sophisticated.
Sophisticated, yeah.
With the ACE community for 3 years now.
Actually outlined everything.
Something that we find in the society.
First, talk about the problems that you're trying to solve.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. We have a very exciting conversation with Renee and Carla today about decentralized gig economies. It's a very interesting topic. We are very excited about it. Let's hear from my co-host Carla and our guest Renee. What's up? What's new with you, Carla?
Yeah, hey. What's new with me? So I just submitted my thesis 2 weeks ago, so I'm officially not doing any research anymore, but I'm still super interested in the whole topic. Currently in San Francisco, exploring the city a bit. It's starting to get sunny outside, so that's kind of cool. That's kind of new with me.
Nice. And this is your master's thesis on...
Yeah, so I was writing my master's thesis on whether dominant founders get better funding, and they do. Surprise. That was kind of cool, getting significant results.
All right, we should do a session on that topic, actually. And Renee, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, how you doing? I'm doing well. Just very busy with the work I do, building communities across Web3. Already have had a handful of calls this morning, and we have just a lot going on. We just actually deployed our front end to Arweave, which is really cool. So we arguably have one of the most decentralized apps in DeSci right now. Super excited to talk with you guys.
That's so great. So what are you all drinking? I've made this cold brew tea that I don't normally make, but it is hot today, so just doing that. How about you?
I am drinking coffee, a little bit of oat milk, and then just black coffee I grind myself. So.
Ooh, nice.
So how do you brew your coffee?
I have one of those kettles where you put the water in the bottom and then the ground's in the middle, and then it bubbles up through the top.
Nice.
So,
oh yeah, like a mocha thing.
Yes.
I see.
Cool.
Nice.
Yeah, I just got this Colombian drip coffee from this Asian bakery around the corner. It's really good. They have different ones. I tried all of them. This is the best one, so I'm going with it. It's a small coffee. As a European, this is what the
What is this? Awesome. All right. So, Renee, you said a few buzzwords. You want to clarify those before we go forward, because they probably will come up again. So you said decentralized apps, DAOs. What else did you say? Web3. There you go. So can we just do quick? What's the definition of each of these terms?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So a dApp is simply just an app that's decentralized, meaning that it's being built on the blockchain, and meaning that the front end is likely not in a centralized server as far as where it's being hosted. So that is kind of what we refer to as the collective products within Web3. And Web3 is just an evolution of Web2, where we assume that if you're talking about Web3, you're likely talking about building technologies that are user-owned, resilient, censorship-resistant, and enabled by the blockchain. And then a DAO, that's a fun one. We actually have sort of a history of our definitions at TalentDAO. So the first definition we ever came up with, which was back in January, is we talked about it as a new form of organization consisting of a shared community with shared purpose, shared capital, differentiated and enabled by blockchain technology. Recently, we've kind of added this definition of a network of contributors coordinating in dynamic virtual teams. So that is kind of how I would describe a DAO. It's a digital organization that is likely community operated, or at the very least, user owned, and there's typically some sort of distributed governance framework that takes place on chain. So, most of the tools being used within that DAO are probably dApps, and most of the people within that DAO are likely pretty well informed on Web3.
Cool. Yeah. So I read your manifesto. The TalentDAO manifesto is, by the way, really cool. And in there, you talk a lot about like the problems with work as we're doing it right now, and how DAOs are kind of the solution to that, or like a possible one. So like how is a DAO revolutionary, like with the background of how like the Great Resignation and all that sort of stuff, like people not feeling like they're doing what they would want to do at work?
Yeah, great question. So when we wrote the manifesto, we were sort of coming from a mindset that DAOs really unlock the potential for entrepreneurship for individuals who sort of maybe not comfortable with a lot of risk, or maybe they don't have a ton of access to capital. And then just with traditional organizations, as you grow the organization, there's a lot of coordination failures. So there's just a lot of people who don't have the opportunity for entrepreneurship, and arguably, entrepreneurship creates the most opportunity for agency and autonomy in your work. So I think that this whole idea of the Great Resignation, like DAOs really open up an opportunity for work-life balance to become much more practical, and creates an opportunity for people that want to pursue sort of a self-sovereign work life.
Okay, that makes sense. Cool. So can you maybe differentiate? So like the way you describe it now, as a DAO contributor is kind of like a freelancer, no? So is there a difference there? Is it only differentiated by me using blockchain, or like being organized in a dApp environment?
Good question. So I would say it is different. The most obvious difference to me that comes to mind is with a freelance or gig economy, it's very much focused on the individual. And, there might not necessarily be a network or community with a shared purpose and shared goals, right? Like Upwork or Fiverr or some of these gig economies, like I go there for my work. It's very transactional. I don't know anyone else on Upwork. Whereas with the DAO, like it's very much communal. I know who works in my DAO. We have shared goals. So I think this is really kind of an evolution of the gig economy that really offers an opportunity for belongingness. And I think that's really important.
I think another interesting thing that I was reading in the research for this session, and that's an article that I will share as well as part of the resources we will share, was drawing the comparison between gig economy and DAOs, in a sense that in gig economy, usually a central entity, call it Uber, Airbnb, Lyft, etc., Fiverr, is controlling all the mechanics of the system. Like, of course, they're getting signals from the market to change their pricing or whatever, but ultimately, they are the ones who are saying, I'm going to take 25% of whatever you're making in your Uber rides, or 40%, or whatever it is, or Amazon, how they charge their merchants, etc. And I think the fundamental difference becomes the fact that in a DAO, the participants in the ecosystem have a say in, they are investors in the ecosystem by their time and even, money, and they're making money, contributing, etc. And as a result of that, they have equity and therefore power of governance to say, well, actually, as a community, we're going to decide that the cut is 5.2% because of A and B and C. Is that roughly one of the reasons?
I think that's a super fair assessment. There's certainly like a stark contrast between sort of the centralized point of failure, or like the need for a mediator or an arbiter between two parties is like a very sort of commonly accepted paradigm in Web 2 and like gig economy and things like that. Whereas with DAOs, like we would kind of cut out the middleman. And I think that is definitely like another big key difference that makes DAOs very distinct from sort of the current iterations of the gig economy.
I I hosted a dinner a few nights ago, actually, on the topic. I usually host these dinners with controversial questions. And the controversial question was, is this decentralization avoidable? And we had a very, very interesting conversation. And again, like I will share the notes and resources from that session. But that topic of the interplay between central authorities and distributed decision making was very interesting, because I don't think we have a very like there are pros of going decentralized, but also there are a lot of buffer that central authorities provide. So figuring out the right dynamics, I think, is something that we still have to work out. But one thing that I don't think we clarified or asked you, Renee, is you mentioned TalentDAO, or maybe Carla did. What is TalentDAO?
Yeah, great question. So TalentDAO is I call it a digital organization building a decentralized research community. And we're very much like a research and data DAO, and we sort of aspire to provide insights and open source tooling to the DAO ecosystem. So we're doing a lot of sort of grant funded research, a lot of open source measurement development, trying to figure out how do we measure contributor health and DAO sentiment and things like that. So we are sort of building a academic peer-reviewed journal that is owned and operated by the community. And it's all open source, deployed on Arweave, front ends on Arweave, back ends all Ethereum. So very resilient, censorship resistant. That's our approach. We're very much a decentralized first in our design principles. So.
That's super cool. Okay. And so doing research, I assume, I know you have a research background, so maybe let's dive into that. Like, what in your research background, and then I know you also went into practice, like what led up to TalentDAO? What were the frustrations, the topics that you learned about, like, and how do they help you maybe now doing this research?
Yeah, so my background's in organizational psychology. So I went to grad school for that and spent a few years in academia. Quickly learned that academia has a lot of problems to it. It's obviously very slow and hierarchical. There's a political game that you have to play to pursue tenure and things like that and build your reputation. Scientific funding is rather broken. Pretty much the only source of funding is from the government, which is tax funded. And then, if you do get that money, most schools are taking a ton of overhead, around 40%. And then you're kind of left with the table scraps to try to do your research. And you can't really get a grant from some of these big, NSF kind of National Science Foundation grants. You can't really get them unless you've already had one. So it's very much a chicken and egg problem. And as an early career researcher, I found that very, very disheartening. So I determined I was going to go applied. So I hopped into Big Four consulting for a few years. And I really enjoyed the work. I thought it was really, really interesting topics, but it sacrificed a lot of sort of scientific rigor. So a lot of what people call research is really just really well-written thought leadership and sort of opinionated frameworks on how to do something, but it might not necessarily be driven by the literature or driven by some sort of experimental or empirical observations. So I was just kind of like dissatisfied with that too. And I had dabbled a little bit in entrepreneurship. I had a startup sort of in another life that was focused on Web 2 data analytics. And we did a lot of like dashboard and financial reporting for enterprise. And I found that very difficult. It was very risky. There was only 3 of us working at this scrappy little company. Pooling capital is difficult. Sort of driving awareness and getting momentum was very difficult. So it was kind of like these 3 experiences that sort of primed the pump for me on this idea of starting TalentDAO. And back in, I guess, 2020 is when I first heard of DAOs. And I got very excited because I felt like they offered this opportunity to really operate as a faster, more nimble, fully digital organization with an emphasis on community. And that got me really excited because I felt like what was really missing from traditional work was that sense of belongingness and that sense of community. So that kind of led me to DAOs, and it just made sense to build a research DAO because I was like, here's all these obvious problems I've personally experienced. I think we can fix them. I think the blockchain can fix them. So let's do it. And I had a co-founder at the time who asked me to write a white paper with them on the future of work. And DAOs came up in that paper, and we created a Discord for ourselves just as a place to kind of talk and drop articles. And after a couple months, a bunch of people joined, and then suddenly we're like, okay, I guess we're going to do a DAO. And that was kind of back in 2021, in like early summer. And then in October of 2021, I quit my job in consulting and went into TalentDAO, building it full time. And it's been a wild ride ever since.
Definitely. What was your first introduction to the importance of community? I know you also worked for a while in non-for-profit fundraising. Was that the first introduction, or how did the community aspect came up?
Yeah, I think probably my first sort of interaction with community is actually within my own field. So the field of industrial organizational psychology, which is the very long, cryptic title of my profession, it's very small. There's probably certainly less than 10,000, maybe only 5,000 in the world of this degree. And one of our conferences, which is SIOP, which is Society of IO Psychology, happens once a year. And I remember attending that maybe 4 years ago, and just seeing some of these professors and some of these colleagues who you only know them from a paper, and then you see them in real life and have fun with them, go out and grab some beers. And that was really appealing to me. It was really appealing to me to have a more emphasis on camaraderie and not just productivity. And I think that definitely was something that I craved. I also am a bit of a closet gamer. I don't really have the time much anymore, but I was very familiar with Discord prior to DAOs because I did a lot of PC gaming and actually did a lot of D&D, role playing, really kind of revealing my nerdiness now. And that was very communal. When COVID hit and you couldn't go anywhere, I just played D&D with my friends online like all the time. And it was, kind of a way to escape the craziness of the world and kind of self-soothe. And I think that really brought on, just for me, to the importance of having a community in whatever you do, because it'll make your business model and your ambitions far more resilient if you have a bunch of people that are willing to uplift you and spread that message.
Yeah, for sure. I can definitely see that. I wonder though, so I'm guessing your DAO, as most DAOs, is completely virtual community. And you're also saying like during COVID that helped for sure, having a virtual community. But so you mentioned going for beers with your professors. That's for sure different than hopping on like a Zoom call with your contributors and maybe playing D&D. That's cool, but it's still different. So how do you, what are the tips you would give to somebody who's like trying to build community, but you're virtual? Like, how do you really create belonging and a sense of like friendship or something in that virtual space?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question, but certainly one we can't ignore. I think you need to establish rituals and norms within your DAO. And what I mean by that is people need to be familiar with where they go to just have a conversation and have an opportunity to connect with people. So one thing we do at TalentDAO is we have like weekly onboarding sessions and weekly open office hours that I'm always on. People can hop in the Discord channel, they chat with me, whatever. If they just want to co-work, that's fine too. We do community calls. We haven't at TalentDAO, but another DAO I do some community leadership for. We've actually done a game night with something like Jackbox TV. So, you share your screen, everybody dials in with their phone, and we kind of play a very collaborative game together. I think all of these are really good. I am seeing a need to get my core contributors actually in person. So we're exploring this idea of leveraging something like Cabin DAO to do some retreats and have some like contributor events and stuff. I had an opportunity to do one of those with sort of a cross DAO initiative, and it was just incredibly beneficial to both like our productivity and like aligning on goals, and also just like my mental health, and having the opportunity to kind of just have some fun in person, I think is really valuable. I think overall the crypto community does that really well, though, with all the conferences. Certainly the conferences I've been to are much more fun, less stuffy. There's parties, there's more time to build friendships. I didn't get that at all in academic conferences, and certainly not at the conferences that they were sending me around to when I was doing consulting.
Yeah, I can for sure like echo that. I remember I think my first like big conference was actually a Web3 conference. And then I was like, oh, conferences are fun. I want to go to conferences all the time, la la la. And at the time I was working for a VC, and then they sent me to this like SaaS conference, and I went and I was like, oh no, I don't want to go here ever again. Like it was so boring. Like everybody was wearing like, their button down shirts and the vests, and like, yes, I'm going to get 10 million ARR, la la la. It was, yeah. So it's very different for sure. Like I feel Web3 is doing a really good job at building community and actually highlighting it and putting emphasis on it, like actively building community, it's not just a side product. It's like a goal as well.
So was Collision better than any of these two?
Oh, Collision was fun. Collision was fun. So that's how Amir and I met at Collision in Toronto. That was a good time. Lots of interesting people there. The city itself was great. But yeah, I feel like, so the other conference I was referencing that I hated was in Barcelona, which is usually a fun place, but I don't know, Europeans can be a bit more like, like a bit more toned down. And then I went to Canada to this conference, and obviously Canadians are like the nicest people. And everybody's like, yeah, come to my home.
Only in summer, though. In winter, everybody's cold and sad. Anyway, I wanna echo what Renee said about communities, and the very interesting thing that it took me quite some time to learn about. I've been building communities all my life, but when I started doing business inside a community or with a community, one of the things that I learned very quickly is that in business, people talk a lot about brand, et cetera, but really that's a very superficial projection of what communities bring to the table, which is a sense of identity and meaning. And that's huge. And, movements like Web3 and blockchain and crypto, one of the main reasons that they have as much activity as they do is because they have created that meaning. Like there's a very, very different future that a few people started imagining and shared with others, and everybody was like, oh my god, like that's so much better than what we have. So can we achieve this together as a community? That shared imagination is so important for communities to work, because if that doesn't exist, it doesn't matter how many events you hold. It doesn't matter what activities you're throwing at people. They might engage, they get bored, move on to the next thing. But when that shared imagination exists, that the story that you want to tell about the future, and people buy into it, see value in it, and importantly, as you said, they know where to go to contribute to it. That it becomes very, very interesting. I want to circle back to your story where you said, you had a Discord channel and there were a bunch of people active on it. There's a co-founder. Was there a co-founder involved at that point, or did that come about later?
Yeah, so I sort of had a co-ideator. I've very much been like a solopreneur and sort of driving the TalentDAO vision. But this was a collaborator who I had done some writing with in the past. We had written this white paper on the future of work. And so he was very supportive and sort of helped champion this early on, and continues to be a really high impact research scientist and advisor in our community. But it was very much kind of like just a place for us to discuss things. And then it was actually a joke. Like if you can probably find it in the general chat in our server, if you go all the way back to like February or January or something like that. We were just like, oh, we should start a DAO. And we were going to call it IO DAO. And I'm so glad we did it, because like people would have been like, well, what's IO psychology? That's a problem that's been trying to be solved for decades. Like people don't know what that is. And then we decided to call it TalentDAO, because the focus of what we do is we study talent at DAOs, and we are a DAO of talent. And it just seemed pretty straightforward to me. But it was really cool. Once we sort of announced that we were going to build a DAO, my Twitter game was terrible. I didn't even have a Twitter at the time, but I was very present on LinkedIn. I have a relatively big network on LinkedIn, and just kind of kept posting about it, and people started joining. And what I'm really proud of is we talk a lot about, we need to onboard people to Web3. Well, I have people in our community that this was literally their first DAO. They knew nothing about crypto, and some of them are now working full-time in crypto, and actually have taken jobs as a result of the people they met through our community and through our network. And I'm really proud of that we a big part of our community came from LinkedIn. Everyone kind of gives LinkedIn a hard time, but I had a great experience kind of pulling those people into what we're doing. And just been super happy with where we've been and where we're going so far.
That's super cool. So it started as a joke. Like, at what point did it get serious? Like, what was the point where you're like, oh shit, like it is actual DAO and we got to do some stuff?
It got serious when a couple people joined who were very operationally minded, very motivated, and said, hey, we should start a Notion. We should create a mission. We should do a manifesto. And I'm like, that's so much work. That sounds like real DAO stuff. Like, I kind of just want to hang out. But really kind of the community inspired me to take it further. Maybe this doesn't have to just be a place where we share articles that we found about DAOs. Maybe this can be a whole research organization. So I think it probably around November is when we got pretty serious. We sort of had like a soft launch at ETH Denver last year and got plugged into the DeSci community. And prior to that, we had really kind of just been not disorganized, but certainly not a shared purpose, which I think is critical to a DAO definition. But yeah, it definitely started as a joke, and it definitely became a DAO once people wanted it to be.
It's very interesting. It's remarkable how similar your story is to my story, because we also started as, like, literally, I started because I wanted to read papers and I was looking for nerdy people to do it. And we started doing that. And over time, more people came in and they brought in ideas. And it's very interesting because, when you collect a bunch of PhDs and, nerdy people, they always end up being like, can we do research? Like, can we just start publishing papers? And that literally happened to us. And as an evolution of that idea, we ended up starting a company that, became Aggregate Intellect. And all of the interesting things that we ended up doing later sort of came out of community members coming to us and being like, oh, can we do this thing? Can we do that thing? Blah, blah, blah. So that's quite remarkable. And we never knew that we can think about ourselves as a DAO. And one of the things that came up in the dinner that I hosted a few days ago was, where does the company end and where does the community start? That's a very, very blurry gray area kind of thing. And one of the things that somebody said that really made me think was that a lot of the time founders start building products because they have a very clear vision of, this is what the future should look like, therefore I should build this particular product, blah, blah, blah. So a lot of them are very opinionated about what should I build and how should I build it. And of course, market affects how they think about it and evolve it and blah, blah, blah. But DAOs are a very, very different mentality. Like, almost as a founder, you should not have a lot of, I don't even know what does a founder mean in a DAO, because you're sort of like the community leader of sorts. You founded the idea, but, the evolution beyond that is just pretty much organic. So how do you reconcile? I know I'm going off script, but how do you reconcile this, that you have a particular vision and a community are bringing in ideas to you? Like, how do you sift through these as the leader? Probably, of course, the decisions are being made communally, but of course, you have to have an opinion about where things should go. So how are these two worlds combined and reconciled in your experience so far?
Yeah, so much to unpack in this question. And actually, the most recent article I wrote in our newsletter, I start to kind of talk a little bit about this. I'm going to try to break this out into a couple buckets. So there's one concept here that we need to talk about, which is progressive decentralization. Another concept that I think we need to talk about is probably product community fit and how that's different than product market fit. And then I think the probably last topic I want to touch on is this idea of leading leaderlessly and creating autonomous work structures and sort of giving people permission to not have to ask. A lot there. So let's start with the progressive decentralization. Most DAOs have a couple different paths they can do. They can start fully decentralized, no central leader, and kind of like from the beginning, the business model is collectively shared. I think a good example of this is probably CultDAO. So CultDAO is sort of an investment public good DAO. The creators are completely anonymous. The protocol is up and running. There's very little people can do to disrupt that governance process, and it's very autonomous. Then there's other DAOs or even sort of Web3 organizations that started relatively centralized. I think a great example of this is Aragon. So Aragon started as a product company building governance tools for DAOs. They've been around a handful of years now. And in this last maybe 12 to 18 months, they decided to do Aragon DAO and progressively decentralize certain responsibilities of that DAO to the community. I think both ways are valid. I think if you're going to start decentralized, you have to have a lot of upfront work done because you can't expect, emergence in a community to take place effectively. You really need to help set the scene on what that shared purpose and what that community's goals are. And, like going back to the CultDAO example, they had a really great manifesto and like, hey, here's the roles everyone plays. Here's how the protocol works. Here's the purpose. And a lot of DAOs, they don't have that, right? They kind of just let loose and say, okay, figure it out. And in that case, like that's more of an experiment. So this idea of progressive decentralization is start with some sort of centralized entity that can sort of drive the ship as you're building it. And then when you feel comfortable, start to decentralize certain responsibilities. So that's kind of the approach we've taken at TalentDAO. That's kind of why I refer to us as a digital organization, building a decentralized community. So I have a DAO LLC in Wyoming that I set up, and like we manage all the boring stuff and the invoicing and the taxes. And, we have the manifesto and the mission and the vision. We do have the product. So from the start, we knew we were going to do the journal build. But I think where it becomes different is we're not building a product necessarily based on my vision. We're building a product based on the needs and feedback of the community, which kind of gets us to that next topic of, product community fit. And why is that different from product market fit? So I think with product market fit, you're looking for two things. One, you're trying to find a customer basis with problems you want to solve. And two, you're trying to quantify the total addressable market so that it's financially compelling to pursue that idea. And that's a very business and transactional approach to building solutions for the universe. I think that with community, you're not necessarily building a product to solve a problem. You're listening to the community and having them help co-create the solutions that make their lives more enjoyable and easier. And you're from the start setting this expectation that it's a user-owned product. It's not just something that we're not trying to extract value. We're actually trying to generate value from our community. And that to me is the biggest difference between that. And then the whole leadership style, this is very difficult. Something that we do at TalentDAO is we don't actually have any job titles. We have roles and responsibilities, and people kind of have their certain research projects they're leading, but I never took a formal job title. If you go to my LinkedIn, I refer to myself as a steward of decentralized work. And I like to define decentralized work as any type of work that can be done autonomously and does not sort of depend on any centralized authority for those task allocations. And I think that's really important in DAOs. So I think in my ways, like if I had to give myself a title, it would be like the chief decentralization officer. Like my job is to basically design myself out of a role, make myself irrelevant, And I long for that day. Like I can't wait to launch our token and like the DAO is off and running and like I don't have to be the pseudo CEO anymore because I am a scientist. Like I don't want to have to drive. And I think that, one of our studies that we did actually that's been funded is the decentralized leadership study. And we've looked at a lot of cool insights there where we are creating opportunities for shared leadership and autonomous teams to perform work. We're very intentional about how we design our Discord, that if a channel gets created, it's focused on a purpose. We have entire guilds that have formed. So we have like a research guild, which is distinct from sort of our ops team, which is distinct from our finance team. So we have structure in place, and there is sort of a centralized component to that. But the whole roadmap is a progressive decentralization path. And I think that's a very different style than traditional leadership, because in traditional leadership, it's all about, increasing your influence, increasing your power, making yourself relevant. Whereas with this way, like there's kind of an expiration date to my leadership, and that's a good thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's super interesting. So I wonder because so I'm also an organizational psychologist, so one of the 5,000, I guess. And so, what if I remember correctly, in the courses I had on leadership, like it's a lot about also like empathy and like that sort of soft stuff, not just like power and influence, but also, enabling your followers and that sort of stuff. So I wonder what happens when you, as a decentralized leader, you organize yourself out of the work. How do you still enable and push forward your community?
Yeah, great question. And I'm sure we could have a whole episode on leadership theories. There's certainly dozens of them. Everybody likes to come up with a leadership framework on what good looks like. I think that it goes back to those rituals and norms I talked about. So creating opportunities for belongingness, creating opportunities for praise and recognition. One of the things we do at TalentDAO is we have a kudos channel where people can give shout outs. I try to write very thoughtful, like multi-paragraph shout outs for each one of my contributors as I have time. And we actually issue non-transferable NFTs in the past. We've done like proof of work badges and kudos awards and things like that. And we also always create opportunities on our community calls for a little bit of social hour and networking. It's not always feasible. It depends on how many people show up. But if it's a reasonable size, we're still in a position where we can kind of go around the room and say hello without taking too much time away. And then I do hope to have more of these in-person events in the future that I think will help a lot. And I am also somebody who reaches out to people individually and like, hey, how are you doing? How's your work-life balance? Are you feeling burnt out? We just actually ran a DAO health survey on ourselves, which is something that Ocean Protocol funded for us to design it. So we're kind of like trying to, drink our own wine or drink our own champagne, however that business cliche term goes. And our results are great. There's a couple areas, though, that there's some opportunity for improvement. So we're going to be talking about those this Friday on our community call.
That's super cool. So what is it's probably super complex, but if you can give me like 3-4 concepts that are very important for DAO health, like what does a community need to be a healthy DAO or a healthy community that's building something or doing something together?
Yeah, great question. There's a really good article posted on Mir from the lead researcher that I'll link for you guys to share out. But I just pulled it up just to have the model in front of me. So when we think about DAO health, we have 3 major subdimensions. And then within each of those 3 subdimensions, there's like different factors that go into that dimension. So I'll talk a little bit about the high level dimensions and then link to the article for you to kind of get into the details. So the main one is DAO culture, which we kind of think of DAO culture as like all of the factors related to like what is the environment you're creating for innovation to take place? What are the procedures and practices that affect justice and fairness? Like, is what you're doing perceived as fair? What is your diversity and inclusion efforts? Do you have an inclusive culture? Is it psychologically safe? So that's kind of like the DAO culture dimension. We also have the distributed team model dimension. And this is basically, do you have goal clarity? Do you have shared leadership? How is your DAO with information sharing? How is your DAO with communication? What are the dynamics of your contributors and their teams? And then the last one is the attitudes and perceptions of the DAO and of the contributors. So this is probably the most familiar to you. And this is like the idea of like engagement and commitment and burnout and your job satisfaction. So it's kind of those three dimensions of like culture, people, and then like structure. And we look at all three of those and how they interact.
So I want to bring us back a little to, so the starting point was a Discord channel. Then a bunch of people showed interest and you started doing more formalized activities. And the original hypothesis was that you're just sharing resources and probably doing some research together. But eventually, I believe shifted or pivoted your vision for this to be a publication, a decentralized publication platform. So how did that evolution happen, and where do you see it going from here?
Yeah, so I think it happened as sort of a necessity to have a shared vision and create a short to midterm roadmap that people can get excited about, that they can have something to contribute to. Research is great for the sake of research. I think we're adding insights and value to the market. We're publishing on Amir and on Twitter and doing a lot of comms around our research. But there's only so many people that can do research, or so many people that are interested in research. And we had a lot of developers and marketers and like all these other types of talent that wanted to get involved. So figuring out some sort of product that was research related, that could also be community owned, that's also solving a problem that's worth solving, was really important to me. And the idea of the journal just made sense. And, it's called the Journal of Decentralized Work. And the reason it's called that is because, at least as of right now, there's really no credible, academically rigorous source of information about DAOs. Most quality scientific research in DAOs is being published either as like kind of nascent blogs on like Medium or like a Mir post, or it's being published in like a journal that like maybe it shouldn't be in that journal. Or in many cases, I know researchers that have a lot of great ideas on how to study DAOs, but they get rejected. They're like, oh, that's not an organization, or like, oh, we only focus on this. Like the ivory tower you get in academia is very focused and stuck in their ways on like, here's the things our journal accepts. So I just didn't really see a great outlet for us. And the thing that came close is probably some of the open source journals and platforms that let you do preprint. And I think, sort of Open Science and the Open Science Collective, they've done a lot of great things. I think where they fail is like that data isn't immutable. It's not community owned, right? And that's kind of the problems the blockchain fixes. So it was kind of like, let's build an open source collective, but let's actually build on technology that'll make this resilient. And so long as Ethereum exists, the Journal of Decentralized Work will as well. And I thought that was a really sort of enticing value proposition. And when we brought it up to the community, they were very much in favor of pursuing this and very excited about the idea of having influence on the type of research we fund, what gets published, what we consider quality, and just all of that. And it's really kind of turned into this opportunity to create a knowledge marketplace that's very much focused on the social aspects of learning and not just the content itself. And I think that's a very refreshing take on how to do science.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. So what you mentioned, I thought was interesting. And I feel like that's a pattern in science and like traditional research, that like, if it's not a known topic yet, it's like hard doing research on it. But like, why are we doing research? To like explore new ideas. At least that's a big part of it. And so, yeah, it just kind of sucks that when you want to explore a new field, it's very hard getting started just because of all the institutional players that are there and that are kind of like, no, back in the 70s, I wrote this paper and I still feel like this is the categories that we should focus on. So we're only going to do that. So I totally see that. Also doing research myself recently for my thesis. It's just just like the modern papers are like on topics from like 10 years ago. And it's like, I don't know, this is outdated. So I think that's a big opportunity for decentralized science to be more up to date and be more relevant to like what's happening right now. But yeah, so one topic that I'm interested in, just so you also come from psychology, our field has a big problem with replication. How do you think about replication? How do you try to incentivize or like ensure replicability within your journal and the articles that are published in there? Is there anything specific that you're trying to do differently from traditional journals? What do they do wrong? What can be done better? And maybe how does blockchain play into that?
Yeah, great question. And I want to comment on what you just said, which I think was really well said, is that traditional research, they very much penalize risky research. They're very risk adverse. And this whole idea of experimenting and exploring the frontier is kind of looked down upon. So I just want to underscore that point. I think that we are mostly focused on innovating related to the peer review process and sort of the social learning aspect, and like creating a community reviewed protocol for publication that can be Sybil resistant. You can have a pseudo-anonymous person with verified credentials. We have thought about the replication crisis. It's obviously like a huge problem. I think my short answer is you need to figure out ways to make repeat studies sexy. Like nobody wants to do something that's already been done because you're rewarded for new ideas that are safe and still within the confines of the boundaries you get put in, but you don't get rewarded if you just redo a study. So I think like there's other DeSci organizations, DeSci Labs comes to mind. That's like they're very big on replication, the crisis, and like how to fix that, how to incentivize that. I think for us, it'll likely be something that we just reward. Like we'll fund research if you want to do a study like that was done in a traditional organization, and you want to study a DAO sample to see if those constructs are correlated or like it plays out how you think it will. That's something we'll totally fund, and I think that's completely valid. So it probably starts with just a mindset shift and encouraging that mindset shift. And once we have that new culture, we can kind of get to the protocol level on how we might engineer something like that. But on a technical standpoint, we're very much focused on like the peer review process and the actual infrastructure required to store a journal and to index that knowledge.
Yeah, and I mean, peer review plays a big role for replicability anyways, right? So getting feedback from others, because the big problem with replicability is not necessarily that you engineered your results and you're trying to fake it, but just the PDF that you put your knowledge in is very confined. And then within that, you're just missing a lot of context. Like this tiny little adjustment in your like R settings or SPSS settings, it can change a lot. And so I think peer review is like plays a big role with getting somebody else's view on your research. And then probably it makes sense to integrate in the peer review process the question of a reviewer, like, could I replicate this based on this? Can I replicate it? And then once we get that into the peer review process, it already solves, I think, a big problem.
Yeah, for sure. It's funny that we are literally doing a design sprint on our product this week on that problem of reproducibility of the knowledge that people are curating on our platform. So I'll keep you posted about where that goes. But I think, other than the infrastructure and the processes that you're talking about, as you said, I'm going to amplify what you said, that the value exchange, the value system in academic publishing is not set to incentivize good, reproducible, and applied work. It is all about publish, 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 so that we can get this position and then do publish, publish, publish. So it's just the hamster wheel that we're in. And one of the things, like I've also spent a lot of time thinking about this as a founder of a communal knowledge economy, that one of the very, very fundamental pieces that is missing in academic knowledge generation is that this concept of research market fit or research community fit doesn't exist. You're not producing knowledge with the purpose of another person is going to pick it up and reproduce it or build on top of it or build a product according to it, et cetera, et cetera. So the fact that there is no thinking about downstream users, like all the thinking, like I've published very high profile papers, but all I cared about was, can I convince these 3 reviewers, which are probably also grad students, right? So that level of verification, a completely flawed review system that we have, which is not incentivizing me to produce a research that somebody can actually use, somebody can pick it up and continue it, et cetera, et cetera. It's just with the purpose of get it through these few people, and then you have a Nature paper, you have a whatever else paper, and then you can move on to the next bigger hamster wheel, right? So that's definitely a very, very interesting dynamic there.
The concept of like research community fit that's super cool. I never heard that before, at least put into this term. I like it. It's really cool because it puts, because as you're saying, like research and publication right now is so short term. Like you're just trying to achieve your goals. You're just trying to hit the marks to then progress in your career and get citations and get this stamp of approval from Nature, stamp of approval from the Cell or whatever. And so if we shift our mindset in doing science to more, okay, I want to produce research community fit that creates a more long-term vision of, okay, how does this research need to be set up? What do I need to provide for it to be actually adding value to the community? And so I think the tricky thing is going to be, how do you incentivize that? Like why would I want to create research that fits the community? I need to be getting value out of that. And how does that work? Why would I want to do that? So I think that's like a very interesting idea space that like decentralized science community is thinking about, but I don't think any of us have a solution for that one yet. But if we do, that's going to be big.
That's actually something that we are spending a lot of time thinking about. And I'm sure Renee has their own version of how they're thinking about that longer term. But at least in our case, what is very interesting is to create lineages. Because what you said was exactly the problem, the short sightedness of publication. Like you're only thinking about one step further, one hop further. You're not thinking about all the graphical relationships that this paper will have with other publications, other researchers, et cetera, because you're not incentivized to do that. But if you can create a system where this publication results in another publication, which results in another publication, and eventually it gets to a point of utility and application, which is monetized. And that monetization can travel backwards to all the entities who have contributed to it. Then you have a very interesting problem statement, because now as a researcher, as a reviewer, as whatever else, I'm contributing to an ecosystem. And if I do a good job, it's likely that gets amplified and gets monetized at some point. And I can see some of that money. I can see some of that. And if it is designed right, with a token-based economy, then essentially my publication becomes an equity in the ecosystem. And that equity can be amplified if it is done right, if it is reproducible and reusable, then that has a very, very significant multiplier. I created equity, but it can be amplified drastically if it is reproducible, if it is usable.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's like, you're basically describing what we at DeSci Labs are thinking about as impact certificates, which is like a retroactive funding mechanism for science, or it could be anything else you're funding retroactively. But basically, I create research, put it in the system, everybody can build on top of it. And because it's logged on chain, whenever somebody decides to retroactively fund whatever big unlock happened after I put my research in, that value will trickle down to me. So I'm very much incentivized to produce something that's actually true, that's reproducible, and that'll have a good impact for society or whatever field I'm doing research in. So yeah, that's definitely one of the models that could solve a lot of problems if it gets adopted.
Yeah, I think to use sort of old language to describe some of what we're talking about is this idea of the scientist practitioner gap, So one thing that I like about work psychology is it very much is applied research, at least if you leave academia. And so like the problems we're exploring are very practical. Like, how do you keep people engaged? How do you design the leadership program? What's a compensation system look like? Where our field really fails in academia is like there's still people writing papers on how to measure job satisfaction, and like I love measurement theory and psychometrics, but like, are those the conversations we really need to be having to push this field forward? And like, how does it help a business person if their survey is a little bit more fine tuned now, right? Like, they don't care about those nuances. So I think DAOs and applied research organizations will hopefully close that gap a little bit between scientists and practitioners. And I am kind of caught up with the impact certificate idea. And I think that we really fail to reward ideas that create a thread for new ideas, right? We tend to focus on papers like, oh, it's been cited a lot, and that's like the one thing that matters, or oh, it was published in a journal with a high impact factor. But we don't really talk about the papers, or like even not even a paper. We don't talk about, oh, that one seminar, that one research conference where somebody had an idea and then a bunch of people went to decide to write about it. There's no proof of record for that original ideator. And I do think that's like a major overlook in science. And I do hope that things like impact certificates, things like IP NFTs, intellectual property NFTs, and like some of these other mechanics that prove that you helped create something will hopefully incentivize people to close that gap. And I would like to think that TalentDAO is very much an applied research organization, and the problems we're solving like are directly applicable to DAOs. We do some theoretical stuff. We're actually really interested in reputation management. So like we're very academic when it comes to like simulations and like trying to measure that. And we've got a few grants that are sort of up in the air, applying to people like Protocol Labs and some of those more technical funders. But generally speaking, most of our research is very easy to understand, very applied, very relevant, and I hope to see it stay that way.
Yeah, I think that's a huge one as well. So one thing that I personally care about a lot is how do we make the general public be more interested in science and research, and how do we, because you said there's a gap between research and practice, but there's also a gap between research and like everything else. It's very much a closed off kind of system. And what you're saying about research being written in a way that's consumable by people who are not experts in the field, I think that's super important. And I mean, I get that in a paper sometimes you need some very technical terms to be precise in what you're describing, but we just need a way to make, maybe it's just like, maybe we should change the way we write abstracts or something. Like, we need some way to at least have anybody be able to come in an open access system, of course, come in and look at the research and like get the gist of it and understand, okay, how is this important to me? Is it at all important to me? And right now that's just not the case. So I'm very curious on seeing like the articles that you will be putting out and how those are more accessible to the general public.
100%. Unfortunately, we are running against the time. I feel like we can continue this conversation for another 24 hours, but unfortunately, we have to cut it at this point. So, Renee, I'm curious, after everything we talked about, what's the verdict? What is the version of the future that you're hoping to build?
Wow, what a question. I'm hoping to build a future where culture is product, community is king, and everybody has the opportunity to be financially self-sovereign if they want to be. That's the key difference there. I'm not forcing DeFi on anybody, but one of the big goals of TalentDAO is to have everybody bankless by 2030. And what I mean by that is to have everybody sort of off the old system and into the Web3 DeFi ecosystem. And that's the future I'm driving towards.
That's fantastic. I love it. How about you, Carla?
So what I'm taking away from this conversation, for sure, we're trying to integrate science more with practice, with the people, with the community. We're trying to get research community fit. I think that's a great term. I'm definitely going to start using. I'm going to steal it from you. So so yeah, for me, based on this conversation, the future that I would like to see is a future where everybody can engage with science and science actually solves relevant problems, and we're not just chasing citations and H-index and impact factors.
100%. What I love about the three of us is that not only we are imagining this future, but we are actually building it, which is the best way of imagining the future. I'm very excited to look up all the terms I learned from the both of you, and all of the resources that you shared. I'm gonna put them all in the recipe and package it so that everybody can go deeper in the topic. I'm very excited to see where we can go. There are a lot of opportunities, a lot of roadblocks, and a lot of central authorities that probably don't want us to succeed. But well, we will. Thank you so much for watching this episode. Hope you enjoyed this conversation and learned something from it. And join us for the next episode next week. Thank you so much. Bye.